Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're digging into something pretty major in global trade.
Yeah. What's on the agenda?
The United States Fair and Reciprocal Plan for Tariffs. It actually kicked off on April 2nd, 2025.
Ah, right. The reciprocal tariffs. Big news.
Exactly. We've got some really interesting details here from an Al Jazeera article that should help us sort of unpack this new policy.
Okay, good. And, for everyone listening, it's worth remembering right off the bat that the U.S., well, it's usually had some of the lowest tariffs globally.
Right.
So this whole reciprocal thing, it's a potentially huge shift in how they approach trade.
Definitely. So fair and reciprocal plan sounds, well, fair. But let's break it down. What's it actually all about?
Okay, so at its core, this plan came from President Trump. He announced it back in February, Feb 13th. And the main idea is, well, pretty straightforward, actually. The U.S. is now going to charge the same tariff rate on goods coming in from a country
Right.
as that country charges on U.S. goods going out to them. It's basically mirroring their tariffs.
A mirror image. So, like, if country X hits our exports with a 20% tariff,
Yep.
we now hit their exports coming here with 20% too.
Exactly that. Tit for tat,
Yeah.
essentially.
Okay. And what's the main driver behind this? Why this approach now?
Well, the Al Jazeera piece mentions Trump's main argument is that the U.S. has been getting a raw deal for a long time.
How so?
He argues that lots of trading partners have basically taken advantage of low U.S. tariffs while keeping their own tariffs on U.S. products much higher. He sees it as, an imbalance that needs fixing.
He used some pretty strong rhetoric too, didn't he?
Yeah.
Called April 2nd Liberation Day.
He did, yeah. Liberation Day for U.S. trade.
Yeah.
It's definitely a memorable phrase.
Mm.
But interestingly, around the same time, he also said the tariffs would be relatively kind.
Kind. That seems contradictory.
A little bit, yeah. Kind compared to what some other countries charge was the implication, I think.
Yeah.
Still, quite a statement.
Okay. So beyond just leveling the playing field tariff-wise, what are the bigger goals here? What does the administration hope this plan achieves?
The article points to a few key things. First, tackling that huge U.S. trade deficit.
Which is massive.
Yeah, over $1.1 trillion in 2023. And it's been over $1 trillion for 4 years straight. So that's a major target.
Okay, deficit reduction. What else?
Second, the idea is to boost American industries, make U.S. manufacturers more competitive.
Right, bring manufacturing back, that kind of thing.
Sort of, yeah. Bolster the domestic side. And thirdly, there's this idea that the money raised from these new tariffs
The revenue, yeah.
could potentially fund future tax cuts.
Oh, okay. Those are definitely some big ambitions.
Yeah.
But surely a move like this has downsides, or at least criticisms.
Oh, absolutely. The Al Jazeera article covers the main worries. The big one is trade wars.
Retaliation.
Exactly. If the U.S. raises tariffs, other countries might just hit back with their own tariffs on American stuff.
Yeah.
That hurts U.S. exporters.
And could spiral.
Potentially, yeah. Into broader trade disputes. And then there's the other big concern, prices.
For consumers.
Yep. Higher tariffs on imports usually mean, well, higher prices for people buying those goods. So everyday Americans might end up paying more.
Let's circle back to that trade deficit for a second.
Right.
You said it's huge, the biggest in the world. How does that compare globally? Are others in the same boat?
Good question. The U.S. is the largest, but it's not alone. Looking at 2023 data, the U.K. had a large deficit, then India, France, Turkey.
So it's not uncommon.
No, trade imbalances are pretty common, actually, driven by all sorts of different factors in different economies.
Okay. And who does the U.S. have the biggest imbalances with, specifically?
Right, the bilateral ones. 2024 data shows the biggest deficit by far is with China. That was $295 billion.
Oh, still China.
Still China. Then Mexico at $172 billion and Vietnam at $123 billion. Those are the top three.
That China figure is really interesting, isn't it? Because we've had tariffs on Chinese goods for, 7 years before this new plan?
That's right, since around 2018.
Yet the deficit is still the largest. Why haven't those earlier tariffs shrunk it more?
Well, their article suggests a couple of main reasons. One, just strong U.S. consumer demand for Chinese products, electronics, clothes, household goods.
Stuff we buy every day.
A lot of it, yeah. And two, supply chains. Many U.S. companies have really complex supply chains deeply rooted in China.
Hard to just switch.
Very hard and expensive, especially quickly. So despite the tariffs, the trade patterns haven't completely shifted.
And weren't there even more tariffs added on China just before this April 2nd plan?
Yes, exactly. In February and March 2025, there were additional tariffs put on certain Chinese goods.
And did China retaliate?
Predictably, yes. Beijing hit back with tariffs on U.S. exports, things like crude oil and some types of machinery.
So it shows how quickly things can escalate.
It really does. Action, reaction, it gets complicated fast.
Okay, so let's talk history for a moment. You said the U.S. historically had low tariffs. That might surprise some people. Can you give us some context on that?
Sure, it's true that recently, say post-World War II, U.S. tariffs have been relatively low. But if you go back further...
But 19th century.
Exactly. 19th, early 20th century, U.S. tariffs were often quite high. The famous example is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930.
Ah, Smoot-Hawley. Heard of that. Great Depression era.
Right, passed after the stock market crash. The idea was to protect American farmers with high tariffs on agricultural imports.
And did it work?
Well, no. The big unintended consequence was massive retaliation. Other countries threw up high tariffs against U.S. goods.
Ouch.
Yeah, many economists think it actually made the Great Depression worse by, strangling international trade.
A real backfire then. So what changed? When did the U.S. pivot to lower tariffs?
The turning point mentioned in the Al Jazeera piece is the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934.
Okay, what did that do?
It basically gave the president power to negotiate lower tariffs with other countries if they lowered their tariffs on U.S. goods in return. Reciprocity, but aimed downwards.
Ah, reciprocal reductions.
Exactly, and that act really set the stage for the more liberalized trade policies the U.S. pursued after World War II, leading to generally lower tariffs for decades.
And having low tariffs, plus being a huge wealthy market, that created a specific dynamic, right?
Absolutely. It made the U.S. a prime destination for exporters worldwide. Low barriers to entry.
Good for consumers, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
More choice, lower prices.
Potentially, yes. But it also meant tougher competition for American companies making similar products domestically.
Which feeds back into the trade deficit issue.
Precisely. It's part of that complex picture the new fair and reciprocal plan is trying to rebalance.
Okay, let's zoom out again. Global trade rules. How does all this fit with things like the WTO?
Right. The World Trade Organization. A key principle there is most favored nation, or MFN.
MFN. What does that mean, basically?
It essentially means you have to treat all your WTO trading partners equally. If you lower a tariff for one country, you generally have to lower it for all WTO members. No favorites.
Ah, okay. But there must be exceptions, like trade deals.
Exactly. Free trade agreements, FTAs, are a major exception. Countries in an FTA can give each other zero or very low tariffs without extending those to everyone else.
Does the U.S. have many FTAs?
It does. The article lists 20 countries the U.S. has FTAs with. Think USMCA with Canada and Mexico, CORIST with South Korea, Australia. Quite a few.
Any other big exceptions to MFN?
Yes. Another allows developed countries to give preferential treatment, like lower tariffs, to goods from developing countries to help their economies grow.
Got it. So globally, where do tariffs range? Who's got the absolute lowest?
Well, at the very bottom, you have places like Hong Kong and Singapore. They're basically at 0% for almost everything.
Why so low?
Often it's a strategy to be, a major trading hub, attract investment. Or maybe they don't have a large manufacturing sector, so they rely heavily on imports anyway.
And the U.S. historically was closer to that low end.
Relatively speaking, yes. Compared to many other large economies, its average tariffs were quite low, a legacy of that post-1934 push for liberalization.
Okay, and who's at the other end? The highest tariffs.
According to the data in the article, countries like Tunisia, Algeria, Gabon tend to have some of the highest average MFN tariffs.
How high are we talking?
Their simple average tariff was mentioned as being around 18 to 20%. Gives you a sense of the upper range.
Simple average tariff.
Yeah.
How do they calculate that?
It's pretty much what it sounds like. You take all the different tariff rates a country applies.
On all the different products.
Exactly. Add up all those percentages and then divide by the number of tariff lines, the number of different products.
So if it's 10% on cars and 20% on cheese, the average is 15%.
Basically, yeah. It's a rough overall measure.
Makes sense. Okay, back to the U.S. plan. Which industries are feeling the heat the most from these reciprocal tariffs?
The article flags quite a few sectors. Let's see. Industrial products, consumer goods, autos, definitely, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, tech, media, telecom, energy, utilities, even private equity.
Wow, that's broad.
It really is. Suggests the impacts could be pretty widespread across the economy.
And you mentioned autos specifically. They got hit right away.
That's right. There were specific tariffs on imported cars announced that took effect right on April 2nd alongside the main reciprocal plan. So the auto sector is definitely front and center.
The article also gave some concrete examples of the tariff gaps before this plan, right? The imbalances.
It did, yeah. Good examples to illustrate the point. One was U.S.-India agriculture.
What was the difference there?
The U.S. charged about 5% on average on Indian farm goods, but India charged around 39% on U.S. farm goods coming in.
That's a big gap.
Huge gap. Another was motorcycles, again with India. Historically, India had a 100% tariff on U.S. bikes.
100%.
Yeah, though they lowered it to 30-40% a few years back. But still, the U.S. tariff on Indian bikes was only about 2.4%.
Okay.
Any others? There was a mention of India recently lowering its tariff on imported bourbon whiskey. It was 150%. They dropped it to 100%.
Still 100%.
Still very high, yeah. But the reduction came after criticism. So these examples really show the kind of discrepancies the reciprocal plan targets.
Definitely paints a picture. Now, leading up to April 2nd, it felt like there was a lot going on with tariffs from the U.S. side, wasn't there? A whole sequence of events.
Yes, it wasn't just the April 2nd announcement in isolation. There was a buildup.
What happened earlier?
Okay, so February 1st, Trump signed orders putting tariffs on all goods from Mexico and Canada, plus extra on Canadian energy and some Chinese goods, too.
Why then? What was the reasoning?
Interestingly, the stated reasons were tied to drug trafficking and immigration concerns.
So using trade tools for non-trade issues.
It appeared that way, yeah. Though those Mexico-Canada tariffs got paused pretty quickly, Feb 3rd, after some border security deals were apparently reached.
Okay, then what?
Feb 13th was the big announcement of the fair and reciprocal plan itself, setting the April 2nd date.
Right.
Then March 4th, those tariffs on Canada and Mexico did take effect, though with some exemptions, and more tariffs on Chinese imports started that day too.
Busy March.
Yeah. Then March 12th, 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum imports globally, aimed at boosting U.S. producers. And then March 26th, just before the main event, the announcement of 25% tariffs on all imported foreign-made cars and auto parts.
So April 2nd was the culmination, but part of a bigger flurry of activity.
Exactly. The reciprocal tariffs and the specific auto tariffs landed on April 2nd, but they followed this series of related moves.
It really underlines this significant shift in trade strategy. And as the article notes, the basic historical impact of tariffs is pretty straightforward, isn't it?
Yeah, fundamentally, tariffs make imported goods more expensive.
For consumers buying them.
Right. And often what happens is domestic producers might raise their prices too because there's less competitive pressure from those now pricier imports.
The prices can go up across the board.
It's a common effect, yes.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together from our deep dive. The U.S. has launched this fair and reciprocal tariff plan. It's a major pivot from its post-war history of generally low tariffs.
Definitely a pivot. Driven, it seems, primarily by wanting to slash that trade deficit and give U.S. industries a leg up.
Right. And proponents see it as leveling the playing field, maybe raising revenue. But there are big question marks, too.
Huge ones. Fears of retaliation, trade wars, higher prices for consumers. History, like with Smoot-Hawley, shows these things can backfire.
So for everyone listening, it's worth thinking about how this might ripple outwards, right? Affect the things you buy, maybe your job, the whole global economy.
Absolutely. These aren't just abstract policy changes. They can have very real, tangible effects on people's lives.
And maybe a final thought to leave folks with. Given how tangled up global trade is now, what are the less obvious knock-on effects we might see from this?
Good question.
Beyond just direct retaliation, what assumptions is this policy making about how other countries can or will respond long-term? Are there unforeseen consequences for supply chains, innovation, global cooperation that maybe aren't being fully factored in yet?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? The deeper systemic impacts. It's incredibly complex. Lots to watch.
Indeed. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.